Christianity is too anti-Christian. That is my thesis here. Well, my point is this. Christianity has, ignored a lot of important things about Jesus. One of the most important things is that Jesus was not a slave to tradition. And Jesus was very focused on his mission being presenting us with the spiritual kingdom. A kingdom not of this world. And it's kind of logical that means that we are not supposed to be dependent on our world conditions for our spiritual expressions. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So, it doesn't matter for Jesus or for your spiritual, relationship with him at all, whether you are on the North Pole or whether you are at the same exact location where he was born on Earth 2000 circa years ago. That doesn't matter at all. So going to Jerusalem does not help you spiritually at all. It doesn't make any difference. Because his kingdom is not of this world. It's not like it's kind of focalized in Jerusalem. I mean, like, if you look at Jerusalem, it's kind of obvious that it's not the center for Jesus' love. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? And it kind of underlines my point here. It's not how Jesus works. It's not some kind of odor or some kind of sound or some kind of a beacon which Jesus placed in Jerusalem, and the closer you are to Jerusalem, the more of his spiritual message you can grasp. That's not how it works. And like you're an idiot if you think it works like that, and you're very secular if you think like that. You're completely ignoring what Jesus did, presenting us with the spiritual kingdom, which was not of this world. Another thing which has hurt Christianity a lot and hurt Christ is the focus on the Old Testament. If someone writes a testament, it makes sense that the New Testament is more important than the Old Testament. I mean, like, if you go to someone and say, this is what is said in the Old Testament, and that guy might logically ask you, what about the New Testament? Don't you think that maybe that's, more important here? Of course it is. If you read the newspaper, does it, if you want to know what's happening, do you read the newspaper 200 years ago, or do you read the new newspaper? You read the newest one. It makes kind of sense, doesn't it? Jesus was opposed to tons of stuff in the Old Testament. One of the main reasons he wasn't more critical of the Old Testament is because he would be killed. I mean, like, Jesus, he was in so big trouble just for making some comments about, the paradoxes in the Old Testament. He was critical of it. And Jesus was very critical of the Old Testament, and it's ridiculous for us to place the Old Testament on such a pedestal. Especially what far too many Christians have done is putting the Old Testament before Jesus. That's just blasphemous, putting, the Old Testament before Christ. Of course, that's not, how it works. Christ's message replaces tons of stuff in the Old Testament. And if we wouldn't run after Jesus with haystacks and knives and batons, he probably would have been more critical of the Old Testament and presented a lot of other things to us. We know, for example, that Jesus highly probably would be more critical of things like the Genesis, because Jesus didn't focus on these things. You can know what Jesus did not like about the Old Testament by also taking into account what he didn't talk about, what he didn't reference to. And there's a lot of things he just never referenced to. He was a big fan, it seems, of the Book of Psalms. That makes sense. The Book of Psalms is one of the greatest books in history. So, That's down now. I've said that. So now to my other points. One thing, it's kind of ironic that the church has been critical of evolution when the church itself has been one of the greatest fossils in history. And like, it's fossilized to such a great extent that it's just ironic that the Pope can, he's not so critical now, but that the popes of the past have been so critical towards evolution when the church itself is one big fossil. That's ironic. I mean, if Darwin came to Earth again, being electrically brought from the dead to life again, he would probably have a very hard time telling the difference between the fossils in the strata of the Earth and the church. What the church has done to Christ. It's taken Christ hostage. And spiritual-minded people should get together like SWAT soldiers to save Christ from, the blightement that the church has put him in. Just, taking Christ from us. They have stolen Christ from us to a large extent. This is something that the institutionalized church has done. That doesn't mean that there are good churches out there, but there are far too many who focus, they don't focus on Christ. They don't let Christ's spiritual message flow. They force Christ into this ice cube and, allow us to watch him from the outside, not, taking into account the whole spiritual thing. So they secularize it, and that's not good. So I think I made my point there. Focus more on the spiritual message. Not what the priest says or your minister says. Because they are not Christ. They are not substitutes for Christ. Christ is Christ. And it doesn't matter who you talk to or anything like that, because the spiritual message of Christ is something you can reach if you reach out for it. Okay? I think I made my point here. And it's all about taking Christ more into account. Christ is too important to be ignored by the church, and they are being blasphemous and also institutionalized people like, we have people like Venom Fang X. He is acting, when he was on YouTube, he was ignoring too much of Christ. He was, fossilizing it. He was like, he was one of the he was ignoring too much of it. He didn't take into account, like other conservative Christians, that Jesus was very opposed to the tradition. Jesus wanted the spiritual message to be very progressive, very advanced, and something that is, blossoming. So don't think of Jesus like the fish, rather think of him like, a flower, which spread its plumes, Okay. I would like your responses to this, and comments. Though I don't want any threats or any kind of accusations that I am blasphemous, because you should take into account that I will respond. And you should argument it here.